Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and today I'm assessing why the upcoming NATO meeting in Brussels is effectively turned into an emergency meeting, why the United States has decided NATO is now obsolete, why Europe is terrified, but what Europe really needs to do in order to dig itself out of the mire that it now finds itself in. Now, this NATO meeting is of the foreign ministers in Brussels on the 3rd of December. Tellingly and perhaps ominously, US Secretary of State Rubio is not going to attend the meeting, which of course just adds fuel to the fire of Europe's rather grave concerns about what is going on with NATO and the US's role in it. Now, no disrespect, but instead the Deputy Secretary of State, Christopher Landau, will represent Washington instead. That is highly unusual, highly irregular, and therefore the question is, why is he skipping it? Does he really think it's just of no relevance anymore? Now, of course, that might not be entirely the case, but given probably what is going to dominate the agenda, Rubio regards the issue of Ukraine, as far as NATO members in Europe is concerned, as being irrelevant. Because we know the United States and Ukrainian officials have been having extensive discussions about how to end the war. There have, of course, been discussions as well between the Americans and the Russians. The Europeans are furious because they feel as though they're being cut out of the entire equation. And the truth is they are, because the United States doesn't regard European NATO members as decision makers. They're there merely to do as they're told, when they're told, and how they're told. This is the reality of NATO, which, of course, then goes back to the whole point of NATO's existence when it was created in 1949, was to defend you against what was the Soviet Union at that time, which was the aggressor. Now, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. NATO got bigger, even though there were agreements, verbally at least, in place with the Russians to say we will not extend NATO's borders, which of course they did. But the reality is NATO was merely a vehicle for the United States to assert itself over the entire continent, to be able to force the Europeans to buy Russian arms to enrich, US arms to enrich the military-industrial complex. There was never any intention of going to war with Russia because obviously Russia's a nuclear power. If you're a nuclear power, then you don't go to war with them because then that's at best mutually assured destruction. And given how Russia's militarily now light years ahead of the US, that is no longer a given in the context of a nuclear war. And what, of course, is fueling a lot of the sort of change in attitude in the United States is precisely because they finally realized Russia is light years ahead militarily, which is why recently Driscoll came out and made the point to the Ukrainians, you cannot win this war. You can't fight this war anymore. Russia can fight this war indefinitely. Oh, by the way, we're incapable of matching them in manufacturing weapons. And from our perspective, the United States can't produce weapons that are remotely on par with anything Russia produces either. And of course, the other major factor in the US's thinking is Russia has a very modern nuclear arsenal. The West's nuclear arsenal is decades old, it's very unreliable, and frankly, there is an argument to say if you try to ever fire nuclear weapons, they'd probably detonate in their silos and never reach the intended target, even assuming, of course, they're able to circumvent Russia's defense systems. So, given all that, now finally Europe seems to have wised up to the fact that the United States has got no intention of defending us in the event of a conflict with Russia. They're just going to walk away, say nothing to do with us, because the United States doesn't want to end up being incinerated with Russian nuclear weapons. The fact Europe's just found out, and they've finally realised they're irrelevant because they're being cut out of talks with regards to Ukraine, they're now in a blind panic. So you have European nations individually, excuse me, and to some degree collectively, in small groups, deciding that they're going to form their own version of NATO, but still, of course, expecting the United States to be there to dig them out of a hole if needs be, and the United States is never going to do that. So this is why we're hearing these ludicrous statements coming out of Europe, for example, that, well, we will launch preemptive strikes on Russia with regards to these alleged Russian hybrid attacks, which are not even Russian hybrid attacks, as though that is ever going to happen. It's a total nonsense. But Europe is desperate to flex its muscles, to make it appear as though it has relevance, as though it is a threat to Russia. And Russia's obviously looking at this going, don't be so ridiculous. The Americans are going, don't be so ridiculous. This is never going to happen. Because at the end of the day, Europe has spent the last 76 years hiding behind the Americans, doing what the Americans say, expecting America to be there to deal with all the mess that may ensue. And America has made its point very clear. We're not doing that. We're not interested. And of course, what makes things even worse from a European perspective is they can clearly see now the United States wants rapprochement with Russia. It wants Russia to be able to help it develop the Alaskan shelf with oil and gas reserves, because the United States doesn't have the technology to do so. The United States also wants to be in a position where it can assess whether there are possibilities for it to develop or co-develop projects in Siberia, in the Arctic region, in the Russian Far East. But what this all amounts to is the plain simple fact that if the United States has this level of rapprochement with Russia, then NATO ceases to exist, because the US can't sit there going, well, we've signed all these agreements. We're having all these projects that we're developing together jointly, whether it's in Alaska or off the coast of Alaska, whether it's Russia. Then therefore, on that basis, it is absolutely impossible for NATO to continue to exist, because who's the United States then going to fight? An ally that it's now had rapprochement with? Absolutely not. And Europe's now starting to go, hang on a minute, are we still an enemy of Russia? And if we are we on our own? What do we do? And they're getting all these crazy ideas that they're going to somehow develop their own nuclear weapons, and they're going to extend their military capability, and they're going to have all manner of recruitment drives to try and increase their individual military presence, and collectively they then sort of form this kind of hybrid NATO with European nations. Well, the problem with that is that at the end of the day, they're in no position to be able to afford to do it. Europe is bankrupt. It's broke. It has no financial wherewithal to do anything. So how's it exactly going to pay for all this? It will need hundreds of billions of euros, and probably $1 trillion in the end, given how everything works out in the West in terms of what something costs. You always add 50 or 100% to that cost, because everyone wants a cut and to make some profit out of it. So in reality, this is not a decision that Europe can make, but it's so frightened because of Eastern European countries suffering from Cold War PTSD, from Cold War 1.0. That includes the Baltic republics, it includes Poland, to some degree some other Eastern European countries. But then you have the more sensible, calculated responses coming from the Hungarians, the Slovakians, probably increasingly the Czech Republic. You're also going to see it more and more from the Southern European countries. It's really the Northern European countries, although they're going to be more flexible in terms of France, Germany, and the Netherlands ultimately, There's going to be this realization that we've had this ideological hatred of Russia. It's not based on reality. We are going to have rapprochement with Russia. Whether certain individuals think that's a reality or not is completely irrelevant, because the alternative is, if they don't, because Europe needs cheap Russian energy, it needs access to Russian resources. If it doesn't go down that avenue, Europe is heading to the dark ages for as long as it takes for it to wake up to reality and understand there is no future without cheap Russian energy, because they think they can rely on US energy. Well, they need to ask themselves why the United States wants to develop all these projects with the Russians. They want to do so because the United States' shale oil and gas are now in decline. So they can't rely on that as an energy source in the future. So ultimately, whether it sticks in their throat now or not in the future, they're going to have to accept that they will need cheap Russian energy. They will need Russian resources. They will need Chinese investment. They will need to have rapprochement on a level with the likes of China, Russia, Iran, etc., if they've got any hope of having any future other than quite literally being in the dark ages. Europe is destined to completely implode if it doesn't do so. So in one sense, the United States' attitude towards Europe is going to drive them eventually in the right direction. From the US's perspective, it realizes that it is going to have to be reliant and more dependent on the Russians. It will even eventually realize the same applies to the Chinese, and to some degree that's already happening, given the recent spat, to put it diplomatically, between the Chinese and the Japanese. It's very self-evident that after Xi spoke to Trump, the United States picked up the phone with the Japanese, said, look, you need to walk away from this to some degree. So there was a little bit of backtracking in terms of the words used with regards to the future of Taiwan and its independence, and obviously not part of the one China state principle or policy. Okay, the spat hasn't gone away entirely, but you can see how the United States is beginning to change its attitude because it has no choice. So therefore, as it changes, these institutions that have existed in sort of post-Bretton Woods world do cease to have any relevance. They're not applicable anymore in the world. NATO ceased to be applicable in 1991, but it carried on because at that point the United States saw itself as the hegemonic power, as the dollar reigning supreme forever. Therefore, we can continue to abuse and manipulate our relationship with NATO countries in Europe. Those days are now over. Therefore, it has to reassess and calculate what the point of NATO is, what the point of its relationship with Europe is. At the end of the day, what's Europe got to offer the United States? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It doesn't have energy. It's not food self-sufficient. Its industry is cratering. I mean, deindustrialization is becoming prevalent across all of Europe. So all Europe would be to the United States is a burden, and a huge economic burden, a financial burden. And it needs rapprochement with the Russians, more so with the Chinese too, eventually with the Iranian. Everywhere that has resources the United States needs access to. Whether the United States ever has reindustrialization is an entirely different question, and we've talked about that previously. We're not here to discuss it. But the United States needs access to cheap resources. Without it, the United States is never going to do anything. It's highly questionable whether the United States can do anything anyway in the future without completely destroying financialization, which is going to be very reluctant to do so. So this is why, in essence, this meeting has become an emergency NATO meeting, because Europe feels it's being completely cut out of the equation with regards to Ukraine, and it has, as we know, but also because they're increasingly realizing if the United States really wants to be friends and have rapprochement with Russia, then NATO ceases to exist. Well, we have to defend ourselves because even though the US is now friends with Russia, Russia still wants to attack us. And the Russians keep making the point to Europe, we don't want to attack you. We'll put anything in written in triplicate, in blood if necessary, to make sure you realize we've got no intention of attacking you. For what purpose? We're not interested in you. Why would we want to take your countries? Then you'd be an enormous economic, financial burden on us. Because remember, you're collapsing. And therefore, if we were to take you over, it would cost us huge amounts of money to bail you out, to resuscitate you as a nation. We've got no intention of doing that on that basis. So get over yourselves, understand the reality, accept the world's changing, stop being in a blind panic, accept the fact the United States never was going to defend you against us, not that we were ever going to go to war with you. It was just a gigantic racket for the United States to sell huge amounts of arms and to effectively control Europe by convincing Europe that without the United States, that they ceased to exist. And they needed that supervision. They needed that buffer. They needed that support. Now they've realized that doesn't exist because it never existed. And therefore, as I said, they're in this blind panic and they have to therefore go away and understand that that's not reality. It's going to be very difficult. But gradually, European nations are changing and eventually there will be a consensus and a realization that everything has to change. It's going to be very difficult to achieve those objectives, but it's coming about. And it will do so in a period of time that is very difficult to assess. But without it, Europe's totally doomed. There's just no other word to describe it. And with that, we end this podcast. Thank you very much for listening, for all your ongoing support, which is greatly appreciated. Please like, share, subscribe, spread the word, because at the end of the day, it's about being informed, not entertained. Apologies for that noise. What happens in the Netherlands on the 1st of every month, they do this test and these sirens go off and it happens on the phone as well for a few seconds. So apologies for that. And with that, we of course end this podcast and I'll say goodbye.